My name is Eleanor. I'm 74 years old, and I live alone in a simple house in rural Virginia, United States. It's a small, light wood house with an old porch where I often sit on cooler mornings after my husband passed away and the girls left to live their own lives. All that remained was this silence. At first, it bothered me. Nowadays, it just keeps me company. I've grown used to living with few words and many memories, some sweet, others not so much, and it was one of those memories that got me up earlier today. I went to hang the laundry on the clothesline as I've done since my first marriage, and amid the scent of soap and the sound of birds, a specific smell hit me, throwing me straight back to a time I'd hidden even from myself. I think it was the smell of wet wood, mingled with the cheap perfume I wore back then. I'm not sure. All I know is it came like a slap, and there, in the middle of the clothes, I stopped. A lump rose in my throat. A tightness gripped my chest. And I thought, maybe it's time to tell. I don't know exactly to whom. Maybe just to myself. Maybe to someone who might need to hear it someday. What I have to tell isn't pretty. It never was. It's one of those stories no one imagines. Could happen to an ordinary woman. But it did. And here I am, after all these years, still living with the consequences. I was 24 at the time, married to Raymond, a hard-working, honest man. But cold. We met at a church gathering, married quickly, and soon our daughter, Lily, came along. We lived in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Richmond. He worked at a mechanic shop, leaving early and coming home late, and I stayed home all day, taking care of the girl, cleaning the house, cooking meals. It was a straight and narrow life, as they called it, but inside I felt lonelier by the day. That's where Samuel comes in. He was Raymond's younger brother, looser, more talkative, full of charm. He'd just returned from the army. Whenever he could, he'd stop by our house. He said it was to see his niece, but I sensed it was more than that. He looked at me differently, and worse. I looked back. It started with silly jokes, compliments Raymond never gave me. Then came the seemingly accidental touches, the conversations that lingered too long in the kitchen, the gazes that held too much. I should have stopped it right there, should have said no, shut the door, told Raymond, but I didn't. Quite the opposite. I let it happen, and the more I let it, the deeper I fell, until one day it happened. We slept together, just once. One single time, but it was enough. A few weeks later, I found out I was pregnant. Raymond and I had tried for a second child before, without success. So for him, the news was a joy. For me, it was the start of despair, because I knew that child wasn't his, and that certainty ate away at me. I thought about telling him. I really did, but every time I tried, I lost my nerve. Raymond was so happy, so excited about the idea of another boy, that I stayed silent. I carried that pregnancy in silence, suffered quietly, cried alone many nights, especially as my belly grew and the guilt crushed me. When the baby was born, Raymond didn't notice anything. It was a healthy, strong boy, and he was proud. But Samuel was never the same. He pulled away completely, stopped visiting. At family gatherings, he barely looked at me, and I understood. He carried his own guilt. Except for me, the guilt came with the child. Every day. It's hard to explain without sounding like a terrible mother, but for a long time, I'd look at my son and see only my mistake. It's not fair to him. I know. He didn't ask to be born this way. And that's why I decided to give him everything I had. Love, care, all a mother should give. But always with this weight inside me, this secret that aged me before my time. The years passed. The kids grew up, and Raymond never found out. Neither did the boy. No one did. Just me and Samuel. Now, all these years later, I'm still here. Samuel died 10 years ago in a car accident. Raymond passed 5 years later from liver cancer. The girls got married, moved away, and lived their lives. And the boy, he's a grown man now. A family man, living in another state. He never knew the truth. Maybe he never will, but I know. And that's what wakes me up in the middle of the night sometimes, heart racing, as if it all happened yesterday. Today, I decided to tell, because hiding it doesn't protect me anymore. And maybe, if someone hears this, they'll understand that mistakes don't always come from malice. Sometimes they come from loneliness, from need, from a lack of attention, affection, love. I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying that's how it was, and I paid dearly for it, far more than people might imagine. Raymond was never much for talking, or laughing. He was the kind of man who woke up early, drank his coffee in silence, went to work and came back the same way. We married more out of habit than passion. Back then, that's how it worked. I was 20, he was 26. Our families knew each other, the church approved, and everyone said he was a good catch. And he was, on paper, hard-working, no vices, honest. But at home, he was absent, always tired, always worried about bills, the car, the shop, never about us. In the early years, I still tried to reach him. I'd make his favorite meals, ask about his day, bring up topics to spark a conversation. But it all died in the silence. He'd grunt or give a curt, "Everything's fine." After our first daughter, Lily, he grew even more distant, spent more time away, and when he was home, it was like he wasn't. He didn't hit, didn't yell, didn't do anything. And that was the problem. He did nothing. There was no violence, but no presence either. And the loneliness of sharing a life with someone who's only there in theory is one of the worst kinds. I felt invisible, and in that invisibility, a void started to grow. A void I tried to fill with my daughter, the house, daily chores, but no perfectly folded towel made me feel alive. No well-seasoned pot of beans made me feel loved. That's when Samuel came back into our lives. He'd spent 2 years serving in Texas and returned to their mother's house, less than half an hour from ours. Raymond was happy, of course. They'd always been close, grew up sharing a room, tool, even shoes as teenagers. So Samuel started coming over often, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just to chat in the afternoon. He was different from his brother. He looked you in the eye, laughed loudly, told funny stories. He had a lightness about him, a lightness this house lacked. With me, he was kind. He'd notice my hair, compliment the food, ask about Lily, simple things, but things I hadn't heard in ages. And that's where the danger begins, because a lonely woman doesn't need much to get carried away. And I was lonelier than I dared admit, even to myself. At first, I thought he was just being polite. But over time, I noticed the looks lingered too long. He'd find ways to brush my arm, my shoulder, my hair, as if by accident. One day, he showed up early. Just me and Lily at home. He brought her a toy, and we ended up in the kitchen talking. For over an hour, we talked about life, their childhood, the war. At one point, he went quiet, looked at me and said, "You deserved more, Eleanor." I froze. I didn't know what to say. All I remember is my heart racing, my hands sweating, and an urge to cry. It was the first time someone had said that to me. In the days that followed, those words echoed in my mind. Deserved more. Did I really? More presence, more affection, more attention. I started to see how faded I felt next to Raymond, and how alive I felt when Samuel was around. That's how the barrier began to crumble. Not all at once. Slowly. A lunch where we sat too close. A time he held my hand a little too long. A goodbye hug that lasted a few seconds more than it should have. And instead of setting a boundary, I let it happen. Found it beautiful. Felt, for the first time in years, that someone truly saw me. Raymond, meanwhile, saw nothing, or pretended not to. He was never good with feelings. Thought bringing home a paycheck was enough, but love doesn't live in paid bills. And it was on a Saturday afternoon that it all happened. Raymond had gone to help a friend fix a truck at a farm 2 hours away. Samuel showed up saying he'd forgotten some tools. Lily was napping in her room. I was in the living room. When he walked in, the air was already thick. The tension between us was almost tangible. He came closer slowly, touched my face, and I let him. It was quick, messy, sweaty. When it was over, I dressed in silence. He said he had to go, and he did. In that moment, I didn't yet know the price I'd pay, but something inside me already knew nothing would be the same. The first few weeks after were pure denial. I tried to go on as if nothing had happened. Cooked dinner, cared for Lily, washed the sheets. Pretending was easier than facing what I'd done. But the body doesn't lie. 2 weeks later, I started feeling off. Morning nausea, aversions to smells that never bothered me before. I thought it was stress, maybe bad food. But deep down, I knew from the first sign. When my period didn't come, I didn't need a test. The despair crept in slowly. Like a cold wave rising through me, I'd stand in the bathroom for minutes, hand on my stomach, as if trying to talk to the secret growing inside me. I had no doubts. The last time I'd been with Raymond was over a month ago. With Samuel, just over 2 weeks. The timing didn't lie, neither did my heart. It was his. And now what? For days, I barely slept. I started avoiding Raymond's eyes, even though he didn't pay much attention. When he'd say I looked pale or off, I'd force a smile and blame tiredness. Tiredness was an easy excuse for women my age back then. You could be falling apart inside, say, "I'm tired," and everyone accepted it. I went out less, hid inside the house. Only left for the pharmacy. Head down. The fear of someone noticing outweighed everything. And Samuel, he vanished. Literally. After that day, he didn't come back. Not for Tool, not to see his niece. And that, in a way, hurt more than the mistake itself. Because that's when I realized, for him, it was just a slip, an impulse, a weakness. But for me, it became a sentence. I was left alone with the weight. He moved on, hid, left me with a growing belly, and a heart sinking deeper each week. I tried writing him a letter but tore it up before finishing. What words would I use? What sentence could explain this? And more importantly, what did I expect him to do? At 2 months pregnant, my belly wasn't showing yet, but inside everything was in turmoil. Raymond was thrilled when I told him. His eyes lit up for the first time in ages. He hugged me tight, said Lily would have a little brother now, maybe. We could even move to a bigger house. I stayed quiet. I wanted to spill it all right there, open my mouth and let the truth pour out. But I saw his smile, felt his tight embrace, and I couldn't. What held me back in that moment was Lily's face. She was nearby, playing with a doll on the kitchen floor, oblivious to everything. And I thought, if this truth comes out, it'll all collapse. Not just my marriage, but the whole family. I pictured my mother-in-law, the siblings, the judgmental stares, the shame that would follow, the pointing fingers. So I swallowed it. Swallowed the guilt, the fear, the shame, and decided to live the lie. But a lie like that doesn't fade with time. It sticks to you, seeps into your skin, your blood. In the months that followed my pregnancy was a constant mix of love and revulsion. I loved the baby, of course. He, was innocent, but every kick inside me was also a reminder. A reminder of the mistake, the betrayal, the loneliness. I dreamed of Samuel, woke up sweating, crying, wanting to scream. I was angry at him, but I missed him too. Because even though it was all wrong, he'd looked at me in a way Raymond never did, and that contradiction tore me apart. It was like loving and hating the same memory, the same moment. When the baby was born, Raymond cried. Said it was the boy he'd always wanted. I cried too, but for different reasons. The boy had dark, deep eyes, like Samuel's, but no one noticed. Raymond thought he took after his side of the family, and I let him think that. Looking at my son was like facing my mistake every day. And still, I loved him with everything I had. I promised myself he'd never feel this weight, that I'd be a good mother, despite it all. And I was. I gave love, food, comfort. Everything but the truth. In those first months, I still hoped Samuel would come back, that he'd see the boy, say something, but he disappeared completely. I heard he'd gone north to work construction, keeping his distance. Maybe it was cowardice, maybe self-preservation, I don't know. All I know is, over time I got used to his silence, and deep down, I realized this story would be mine alone, a story buried alive. But buried stories don't die. They just wait for the right time to resurface. The first years after my son's birth were like living in 2 worlds at once. In the outside world, I was the devoted mother, the calm wife, the housewife who did everything right. Raymond kept his routine. Work, dinner on the table, TV at night. It wasn't a marriage full of affection, but it was stable, at least on the surface. Inside my world, it was stormier. I'd wake up at night, heart pounding, dreaming someone had found out, carrying a guilt that didn't consume me only because that boy, so small, so sweet, gave me air to breathe. He reminded me that despite everything, I still had something good to give. I cared for him with all the love I could muster, and I cared for Lily the same way. I never treated them differently, never. But inside, the truth never stopped weighing me down. Especially since Samuel was gone for good. Years passed, and he never set foot in our house again. Sent a Christmas card to his mom, and that was it. It was like he'd erased everything. Sometimes I wondered if he remembered, if he thought about it, or if he'd wiped it from his mind. I never knew. There were moments I nearly broke. I remember once when Lily fell off her bike and cut her knee. I ran to her, frantic like any mother. But when she looked at me, tears in her eyes, and said, "Mommy, you're shaking," I realized the pain I hid was leaking through the cracks. I was always on edge, tense, as if waiting for the truth to explode at any second. That day I decided to turn to church. Not to confess, but to find some kind of peace. I started going Sundays, alone. Raymond didn't care much. And there, in the back pew, I'd listen to the hymns, the readings, grasping for a word to hold on to. I can't say I found forgiveness, but I found silence, a different kind from the one at home. A silence that didn't demand, just listened. And there, little by little, I started piecing myself back together. Over time, my son grew. He was a bright, happy boy, deeply attached to me. He adored his sister, and they were thick as thieves. When he turned 6, I wrote myself a letter. It said, "You'll carry this to the end, but he won't. He deserves to grow up light." I tucked it in a box at the back of the closet and never read it again. But writing it made me feel a little freer, because deep down I knew that's what mattered. Them growing up well, and that's what I did. I poured everything into them. Became the pillar of the house, even if inside I was always balancing on a tightrope. The years that followed were calmer. The pain didn't vanish, but I learned to live with it. And time, though it doesn't heal all, teaches you to breathe slower. The house grew lighter. The kids grew up. Raymond stayed the same, but it didn't wound me like before. I'd built my own strength. And that no one could take from me. If this story touched your heart, if you've ever hidden a pain from the world, subscribe to the channel. There's still so much real life to tell. Sometimes, just hearing someone survived, what you're living through, eases the weight in your chest. Back then, life didn't give me a choice, but I chose to survive, to protect my kids, even if it cost my peace. And looking back now, I know I messed up, but I also know I loved with all I had. And I stayed standing because no woman should carry everything alone, yet so many do, and still they go on. When my son turned 12, I started noticing things that unsettled me. The way he talked, gestured, eerily like Samuel, the way he furrowed his brow when thinking, the deepening tone of his voice, even his laugh. Every time I saw it, it was like the past leapt out at me, reminding me that no matter how deep I'd buried that secret, it was there, alive, breathing, growing right before my eyes. No one in the family ever said a thing. No one ever suspected. Raymond kept treating the boy as his own, took pride in him, took him fishing, taught him to fix car engines. Sometimes I'd watch them together and feel cruel for lying, for stealing his chance to choose. But then I'd think, what would I gain by telling the truth? Destroying everything for what? Remorse? Justice? No, it was never about justice. It was about survival. I survived each day with that burden in my chest, because confessing would have been dropping a bomb on everything I'd fought to hold together. One autumn Sunday, we were at my mother-in-law's house. She was old by then, barely walking. The whole family gathered to celebrate her birthday. Everyone was there, my daughters, nephews, in-laws, and Samuel. After over a decade, he showed up, older, face weathered, but with the same eyes. When he walked in, a chill shot up my spine. I hid in the kitchen, pretending to chop vegetables. He saw me too. Our eyes met for a second, and he looked away. All afternoon, we avoided being in the same room, but I caught him glancing at the boy, quick, discreet, but intent. It was the first time I saw Samuel really look at my son. The first time I wondered if he knew, or if he just felt it. As we were leaving, everyone was outside waiting for Raymond to bring the car. Samuel came over. For the first time in years, he spoke to me, quietly, directly. He said, "He looks like me, doesn't he?" My body locked up. I had no answer, just stared at him. His eyes were steady, but there was pain there. Pain and regret. That was all he said. Then he walked off, got in a car with another relative, and left. That night, I cried like I hadn't in years. I knew then that he knew, that he was certain, and that maybe he'd carry that secret with me to the grave. But those few hushed words shook me like an earthquake. Because until then, I'd clung to the illusion that no one knew. After that day, the illusion shattered. I started looking at my son with a new kind of fear. Fear that one day he'd find out. That someone would tell him. That he'd ask. I began noticing his features. The questions he asked. Comparisons to his uncle. When family remarked he took after his dad's side more than his sister's, I'd hold my breath. One day he came home from school, asking about his dad's family. Wanted to know more about the past, their roots, for a history project. It chilled me to the core. What if he dug into records, photos, dates? What if someday he got curious and took a DNA test? That's when I hit a crossroads. I could keep lying, keep everything as it was, or, for the first time, prepare the ground for a possible truth. I started writing in a notebook, a small blue one, where I poured it all out. Dates, memories, regrets, not to hand over, but so if he ever found out he'd have my side. Not to defend myself, but so he'd know that even in my mistake, I never stopped loving him. I wrote that notebook by hand, over sleepless nights, crying silently, folded it, sealed it in an envelope, and hid it in the back of the closet with the old letter I'd written myself years before. The truth couldn't come out yet, but I needed it, to have a place. Around that time, I got sick for the first time. A lung infection, high fever, a quick hospital stay. The girls were worried. Raymond seemed shaken, but I knew that illness had another root. It was like my body was tired of carrying it all alone. Even sick, I could only think one thing. What if I don't make it? What if I die here with this secret trapped inside me? In that hospital bed, I prayed like I hadn't in years. Not to shed the guilt, but to ask for time, a little more time, because I wanted, somehow, to fix what I could, or at least leave an answer for when the question came. The trouble is, questions like that, sometimes they never come. But the pain of waiting is like a sharp knife, silent but relentless. Today, after all these years, I can look back with more clarity, not less pain, but more understanding. For a long time, I thought my biggest mistake was that night with Samuel. But as the years went by, I realized the real mistake was living in silence, spending a lifetime pretending everything was fine, when inside, the weight nearly drowned me. It wasn't just a slip, it was a choice made in a moment of need, emptiness, emotional abandonment, but still a choice. And like all choices, it had a price. A steep, quiet, constant price. And that price shaped the woman I became. My kids grew up. They're adults now. They make me proud. Hard-working, honest, good parents. The boy born from that secret turned into a fair, generous, vibrant man. He never knew, never asked. Sometimes I think maybe he sensed something deep down but chose not to face it. Maybe instinct, or protection, or just love. He treats me kindly, calls every week. When he visits, he hugs me tight, and I, without saying it, hug back, as if silently asking forgiveness. He doesn't know what I carry, but he feels how much he's loved. And maybe that's enough. Raymond died never knowing. It was aggressive cancer. We found out late. Those last months were tough, but he was surrounded by love. The girls were there. I cared for him to the end. And I'll admit, during that time I studied him a lot, searched for signs, anything to tell me if he suspected. But I never saw it. Just a tired man, softened by time, who, deep down, did the best he could with what he had. The anger I once felt for his absence turned into a strange kind of compassion. Everyone has their story, and his had wounds I never knew. Samuel died before him. A car accident on a wet road in rural North Carolina. When I got the news, I sat still for hours, didn't cry right away. It was a different grief, a grief with no place. We weren't anything official. There was no relationship, but there was a story. And stories like that, even hidden, leave marks. I remember going to the backyard, sitting on the bench by the rose bush, and staying there till dark, replaying it all, wondering if in the end he'd have done things differently. I never knew. But I wanted to believe he would have. I still keep that notebook I wrote, in an envelope, carefully folded inside a box in my closet. No one's ever seen it. Sometimes I reread parts. Thought about burning it, but I can't. I think it's proof that even in my mistakes, I tried to do right after. Even if late, even my way. What this story taught me is that not every secret needs to be told, but every secret needs to be understood and forgiven, if possible, first by the one who lived it. That took time, years, decades, but one day I looked in the mirror and said to myself, you failed. But you loved too. You lied. But you protected too. You lost yourself, but you found a way to keep going. We're not made just of what we get right. We're made of what we carry in silence too. And I carried it too long. Today, even with a frailer body, a memory that falters now and then, my soul feels lighter. It still hurts, but not the same way. When someone asks if I regret it, I say, yes. But I also say that back then I didn't know how to be different. I was another woman, another mind, another heart. And maybe that's why I'm telling this now, so other women who feel alone don't have to mess up to feel seen, so they don't mistake attention for love, so they know their worth before someone makes them feel they have none. It rained here today, one of those rains that start soft and build slowly, leaving everything damp and still. I spent the day inside, listening to the drips on the roof, staring out the window like I was waiting for something. I don't know what exactly. Maybe just peace. Maybe just time passing. I sat in that same rocking chair on the porch, warm tea in hand, remembering everything I've told here. A story I never thought I'd have the courage to unearth, but one that's always lived with me. You can hide a lot from others, but from yourself, not for long. Now I'm an old woman with white hair and slower steps. I don't chase anything anymore. Don't expect big things, but I carry something worth more than any calm. Clarity. I know what I did. I know where I went wrong, but I also know how hard. I tried to protect the ones I loved. Even in my bad choices, my heart was never cruel. It was just hurt, tired, lonely. If I could go back, would I do it differently? Maybe yes, but maybe I wouldn't have the strength I have today, because some pains teach more than any joy. And I learned that love isn't just presence. Love is responsibility. Love is care. For others, and for the truth. And above all, love is finding a way forward, even when everything inside wants to stop. My kids don't know the full story. Maybe they never will, and if they do someday, I hope they can look at me with the same love I've always tried to give them. That they'll see that, despite the mistake, I never stopped being a mother, never stopped loving. And if you, listening, out there, carry a hidden story too, a secret that feels too heavy, take a deep breath. You're not alone. So many live in silence out of fear, shame, protection, and sometimes just knowing someone else went through something like you did eases the ache in your chest. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. The next story might feel a lot like yours.